Everybody, welcome back, and we're going to do another big jump. It's part two of the big jump series. We spoke with Ben from the Blades Pod, checking in with our friends from the Championship last season. Ben was obviously very happy with life. Everything was absolutely wonderful. We're off to Norwich now, where things are going less well than Sheffield United, but I'm sure we're going to get chapter and verse on all the intricacies and all the nuances from Mr. Connor Southwell. Connor, when did I last see you in a Burger King at Wigan? Would that be right?
That sounds about right. Yeah, somewhere glamorous.
I
Somewhere
wasn't
glamorous, I'm sure.
eating, you were, yeah?
You stitched me up there.
You invite me to all the loveliest places. Now, before we talk about Norwich's big jump, you had a big jump of your own, didn't you? In the summer, which was great news. So you went from one area of seats to another area of seats. Tell us what happened, because this is brilliant.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to get a job at the EDP, which is the local newspaper in Norfolk, covering Norwich City, which is pretty much as close to a dream job as I could get. So yeah, incredibly fortunate. I think
Stop it.
I think
Well
I've only seen
deserved.
I think
Behave.
I've only seen two wins so far. But there we go. Still enjoying it. It's no, it's been fantastic, and yeah, the guys there have been fantastic. So yeah, as you say, a big jump, and hopefully we'll be watching Premier League football next season. Although it looks a bit shady at the moment.
Are you going to get the same thing I get from Leeds fans, where it's basically your fault that Norwich are losing now because they win. You
Yeah,
start working in the stadium, lose. So it's actually your fault, yeah?
yeah, I've had that a few times.
Oh, you had
Manchester
it
City,
already?
yeah, Manchester City was the first game I worked, so that was quite the one to start with. And then since then it's been, I think, Bournemouth and Everton the only games they haven't lost. So
Oh,
yeah, I've
Christ.
had a little bit of that, and two of those have been away. So only one win at Carrow Road so far.
But seriously, I'm sure from everyone who watches the channel, because there's this nice community of us guys that all kind of, speak, and it's people like me that do it for a hobby and whatnot. I'm obviously a lot older than you, but it's really cool to see when people can go through and make a living out of it. I think that's great for this like YouTube community, that there's the likes of you that go through and get the job. So as you can imagine, I was very pleased when you did. And of course,
Thank
because
you very much.
I'm your friend and now I have an inside line on certain things, but there we go.
Absolutely.
There we go. So look, we last did a show, Connor. It was March the 15th. I've checked it
Was
back.
it?
I haven't
Goodness.
watched it because it's like an hour and 15 minutes long, and we called it The Story of Norwich's Unlikely Promotion Push. So let's just set this up. At the point you and I spoke, there were 37 games gone in the Championship. Norwich are top, so 9 to go. We don't know this at the time. They're in the middle of an 8-game win streak that basically was enough to just burn off Leeds and Sheffield United chasing. Norwich finished the league season with this absurd run: 13 wins, 5 draws, and 1 defeat in the last 19 games. If you want a title-winning running, that is it. Just quickly before we talk about, because this is all about how you've coped with the promotion, but just quickly reflect on that win streak and just that ridiculous 2019 up to sort of June.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned those figures, because I think for myself and for other supporters, it probably didn't feel as comfortable as that, particularly towards the end. I remember it might have been Easter Monday when Norwich went to Stoke and drew, and that felt like a real big moment, and a moment that Norwich could fall away and lose it, because obviously it was Sheffield United and Leeds were in the chasing pack, and there were probably a lot of Norwich fans. I mean, the coach, I went to that game. The coach on the way back was pretty silent until I think Brentford went a couple of goals up, and then everyone perked up again. So it certainly didn't feel as comfortable as those figures you said there, and probably externally, everyone probably at that point would have said Norwich were up, but I think fans know the club and know what Norwich have done before, so perhaps didn't think it was going to be as plain sailing. But no, in terms of that run that you mentioned there, I think that's as good as it's been certainly in my lifetime as a Norwich City fan, because not only the way it was more the way they were winning games as opposed to winning, and this was a side who had been assembled. It was full of rejects from elsewhere. It was full of people who they took a little bit of a chance on, and they'd been moulded by Daniel Farke into a cohesive side who played brilliant football and brilliant to watch, scored plenty of goals, conceded a few as well, particularly at home, which they've carried over into the Premier League, incidentally. But yeah, that 2019 I think is as good as it's been for Norwich City fans probably since a certain Paul Lambert was here.
And and you just seem to get this in the run-ins, don't you? Someone will do. I remember Cardiff the season before. Someone will do that streak at that vital time where it's just win, 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 win. And I heard Paul Merson, who sometimes does say some smart stuff. He said even when you're champions, you only play really well, sort of 10, 15 times, and a lot of the other wins are just do the job and get it done. And yeah, just an amazing promotion, like we spoke about on that last show. On June the 6th, Paddy Davitt does a long form interview with Stuart Webber, which I remember listening to whilst I was mowing my lawn. I haven't been able to mow my lawn in forever now because it's all very wet. A couple of things jumped out, and with hindsight, I think Webber was foreshadowing some stuff right from after the Villa game. He said whatever happens next season, we know we start 2020-21 in a miles better place than where we were, and he quickly rules out Jordan Rhodes and an expensive high salary player coming in straight away. We'll go through the actual business that Webber and Farke did do, but is he dropping a massive hint here that from the second you were up, we're going to bank the TV money and we're going to roll with the team that got us up?
Yeah, he's very good at that. He's very good at being honest and telling people what he's going to do. I think if Norwich fans have learned something over the last few years that he's been here is that he delivers, and he doesn't. He's not very political in terms of his answers. He won't give a vague response to something and then do the opposite. He tends to be fairly direct and fairly honest with his answers. And yeah, I think you're right. It was him preparing and the supporters that there was going to be no major spree, because I think when you get promoted to the Premier League and the figures of 100 million, 120 million come out, people think you receive that money in one chunk and it's there in your bank account the next day. And it's not quite like that. You get it in instalments, and you don't get the first instalments until I think something like October, which is why Norwich had to take out a loan to make sure that they covered themselves in that period. So yeah, this was Stuart Webber being his pragmatic self, I would argue, and probably trying to downplay everything. I think after a promotion, everyone's high and everyone's looking forward to the season that's going to come. And there was plenty of talk about this being Norwich's best team to get promoted. Certainly individuals mentioned about how excited people were to see them in the Premier League. So I think this was Stuart Webber saying, look, Aston Villa, Sheffield United are going to have money to spend because they've got owners who pump money into the club, which is their way of doing it. And for Norwich City, even in the Championship, they had to find a different way to that and had to recruit smartly. And for him, this was him pointing at that really in terms of the transfer business. And that, look, just because we've got promotion doesn't mean the situation drastically changes and we're going to spend 15 million on Simon Mignolet, which I think was the link at the time, which is ludicrous.
Whoever loved that one, didn't he?
Absolutely, yeah, he did. Yeah, I think he laughed it off himself, didn't he? So. But no, this is him prepping supporters, because Norwich fans being Norwich fans, and probably not to pigeonhole them, because I think there's facets of everyone's support who think that Premier League just means instant success. Actually, Norwich are going to be in a funny situation where if they go down next year, they're probably going to have more to play with in terms of fees and money than this summer. So I think he's just making that clear, and as you say, quite rightly foreshadowing the situation, because there's a lot of Norwich fans who can get carried away, I think, when they get in the Premier League.
I almost feel a little bit sorry for him, because he's kind of paying for the sins of those who came before him in your Matt Jarvis, Gary Naismith, Van Wolfswinkel, all of those names we can reel off where this pit of money. And even though he would likely guaranteed spend it better, it's almost like he can't until everything's stable. So right, here are the signings then, Connor. So classic Stuart Webber group, this one, isn't it? So on loan comes Ralph Farman, German goalie for an apparent €3 million loan fee. Roberts and Amadou, so a lot of talent in on loan. A couple of youngsters who we probably won't see, Rocky Bushri and Daniel Adshead, don't know how to pronounce that. The only really kind of permanent first team ready guys are Sam Byram, who's actually been quite a success, hasn't he? And Josip Drimic, if I'm saying that right as well. Just talk to me about that group of signings. What do they bring? And normally with a signing, you think, oh right, he goes into this position, which means so and so's now not in. I don't really see that with this group. What's the thinking, do you think, behind that bunch?
Well, to start with Ralph Fearman, I think there was probably a lot of talk in the summer about Tim Krul and whether he was good enough for the Premier League, which seems ludicrous now given the start he's made. He's probably been, well, as we sit here right now, he's probably the shoe-in for player of the season, as that's how good he's been for Norwich. But there was serious doubt about his ability. Made a few errors in the Championship last year. Perhaps didn't perform to the best of his ability, but it was his first full season since about 2015, I think. So understandable given the context. So I think they wanted to provide a bit of competition for him that wasn't Michael McGovern. And what they got was a player who's played in the Bundesliga, in the Champions League for Schalke, someone who had lost his way again a little bit, and it fits that theme of players who just for whatever reason it isn't working for them at the moment, and Norwich take that chance.
So good at exploiting that market as well, Connor.
Absolutely, yeah, because that's where you find value ultimately, and that leads me onto the permanent signings, which I'll come on to in a moment. But in those loan signings, you probably see, as you said, a bigger loan fee, because you can almost afford to pay that in as a loan. It's less of a risk than a permanent transfer for someone that you can't get value out of. And I think Fearman is the wrong side of 30 now, so. Experience for a season. If it goes massively wrong, you would probably think the wages are probably fairly seismic, perhaps not all of which Norwich are paying, but certainly the ones he's on at Schalke. So that is probably like a low risk loan signing. Ibrahim Amadou, again, they've got a clause at the end of the season. If they stay up, they can sign him for £10 million. He's someone that just to bolster their defensive midfield. We're only really talking about Alex Tettey in that position. I mean, Tom Tribal as well, but I don't think he's quite as sort of defensively minded as Alex Tettey. So Amadou as well can also play centre back. So they think they're quite fortunately after what I'm sure we'll come on to in terms of their injuries. And then Patrick Roberts, we haven't really seen, in fairness. I think he's played 14 minutes of Premier League football. Someone that Webber said he's tried to sign before, certainly tried to sign for Norwich last year in the Championship. Manchester City wanted him to go out to Girona in La Liga. He got relegated there, didn't play too much. So this is someone who they were going to hope to come in and play that attacking midfield position, but Todd Cantwell's done so well there that actually Roberts hasn't really had a look in. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure Daniel Farke is having him for whatever reason. And despite a fairly decent pre-season, it must be said, Patrick Roberts, I remember him having a really good game at Luton, but just hasn't quite clicked for him so far. And that, again, whether they look to terminate that or review it in January, we'll wait and see, but I would imagine there's a possibility. And then on to the permanent signings, I think it's 750,000 in total they spent on these, and that is all on one man, and that's Sam Byram, who has probably made the biggest impact of any of the signings so far in fullback. He's played 5 games, I think, and Norwich have won 2 of those. So that says about his impact. Right back, left back, again, someone who lost his way slightly at West Ham, was when he was at Leeds, was a big up and coming thing.
I was going to say that, Connor, because I always remember it was him and Mowat in that team, and Mowat is playing really well for Barnsley now, and it's like they've both kind of found their way. You know, I'm sure, you know, that they may meet soon, but but they're both playing very well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and he's another one who you'd put in has had a lot of injuries at West Ham, hasn't been able to really nail down a position, and this is where Norwich find value in players, which leads me on to Joseph Drmic, who is an interesting case. He's you may or may not know he's released a song recently, which is interesting.
Brilliant, straight away.
Interesting. No Tomorrow, I think it's called. It's worth checking out.
Okay,
it's quite something.
Is it good?
it's not of
Move
my
on.
taste. It's not of my taste, but I'm no expert. But yeah, he's had seasons where I think he was either the second or third top scorer in the Bundesliga. Had a few moves, again, a few injuries. So this is a player who, again, has lost his way. And we're talking about someone who has had a lot of injuries, but equally he's come to Norwich and had a lot of injuries. But when you fish in that market and you're looking for talents who perhaps are a bit rough around the edges, then you do get, that is the gamble you take, that some of them might have fitness issues, that some of them might not be quite right in terms of personality, and that's where Norwich's business is this summer. It wasn't a lot. As we said, Sam Byram's really the only one who's made a massive impact. You could probably put Amadou in there as well, although we haven't really seen enough of him at defensive midfield to comment. And then the other three we haven't really seen too much of. Obviously, Dermich is behind Pukki. He's out injured till January at the moment. Roberts can't even get in the 18, and Ralph Fearman has been secondary to Tim Krul, who's been fantastic. So that's Norwich's business in a nutshell.
So off we go, and of course you want the European champion, away on your first game. But it looks awful familiar. So Krul, Aaron's Godfrey, Hanley's in for Zimmerman. More from him later. Tribal and McLean, who I believe when you did the 8-game winning streak, that was the two that came in that double pivot. Buendia, Steeperman, Cantwell, as you said, has obviously been on the weights and been doing lots of running over the summer because he's come back a different guy, hasn't he? Ahead of Anel Hernandez and obviously Pukki. So this looks incredibly like the promotion team, which the more we think about it now with hindsight, was literally just all-out attack, wasn't it? Even the two defensive midfielders were sometimes like Mario Vrancic and Mo Leitner,
Yeah.
who's hardly John Eustace sat in front of the back four or something, is it? Is there any change in strategy at all, or is it literally, nope, this is what we've been practicing, we're going to do it at Liverpool, and whatever happens, happens?
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. And it was Dyson with death slightly, I think some would say, but this is the Norwich and the Norwich they've built. I don't think they particularly fear anyone. They're very, Daniel Farke's very stubborn in his ways anyway. I think in terms of his philosophy and how he wants to play, and I think he wouldn't be being true to himself. And subsequently, he's actually come out and said in a lot of press conferences, I don't actually have a team that's capable of parking the bus, which is quite interesting. So yeah, very much more of the same in terms of how Norwich played in the Championship. Of course, they found themselves 4-0 down at half time, which was an interesting predicament for them to be in. And I was in the away end that night, and there was actually a lot of Norwich fans who weren't too upset about that. I think obviously context and stuff, you're playing the European champions, it was always going to be a tough game. But they were pleased that Norwich went there and attacked and tried to implement themselves and tried to assert themselves and assert their game onto the Anfield pitch, which is incredibly difficult for any side to do. And I think actually coming out of that game, Norwich had more shots than any side had had at Anfield in 2 years. So that says about how well they did it. And in that second half, for me, that was the major thing, because although Norwich lost 4-1 rather, I left Anfield and left the away end probably feeling more optimistic about Norwich's prospects in the Premier League than I did when I arrived. Just because of how they adapted and how well, and okay, you can argue whether or not Liverpool took their foot off the accelerator in the second half, which could have been, and especially given they had a shorter summer, we might not have seen them at their best. But Norwich defended well and adapted well, and obviously scored a goal, deserved that goal. And there was a lot of positivity in the air because that was the Norwich City we'd seen in the Championship. It wasn't a Norwich.
Buendia on the run, flicking it through to Pukki that we saw every week the season before.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful pass as well, and a very, very good goal and a well worked goal. And as we said, this is the Norwich fans knew what to expect coming into the Premier League. They had spent very little money. It was going to be the tried and tested in the Championship, and hope that works in terms of the approach and the philosophy that they've created. And that night there was a lot of positivity, and I think rightly so, given their second half display. And they obviously won plenty of plaudits on Sky TV and also for people who watched it. I think although the word naive got chucked around a little bit, and perhaps they were a little bit naive, but that's a strong trait of Norwich. They have to be
Naive
naive.
would imply that they didn't know that there was a risk, and
Yeah.
I think they did know that there was. I don't really buy that. I thought that was
Uh,
unfair, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah, and so did I, because as you said, they're very comfortable with risk. They're very, very comfortable with risk, and they know to survive and to do or to compete in the Premier League the way they want to compete. There's going to be an element of risk to that, because there is still, and even between themselves and Sheffield United and Aston Villa, there is a financial disparity. They don't have rich owners. They don't have millions to play with that they can lose, as we're seeing at the moment, go on a bit of a losing streak and change their entire team, or bring in players that they've signed for 15, 20 million. So this is Norwich. This is the core group, and it's not much different to the Championship. And if they're going to survive, then they're going to survive playing their way, I think.
Um, Confidence was actually really high after the next one because you beat Newcastle 3-1, and obviously the question that always gets asked when you have a star striker in the Championship, oh, he'll only score 4 goals all season. And he gets a hat trick, Pookie, and scores. So he's got 4 in his first 2 games, and kind of. I've just been banging my head against the wall with these Premier League pundits. You know, it's like we
Wait,
know.
where's he come from?
Where's it?
Yeah, it's
It's
that, isn't
like,
it?
oh, Reece James is good. Oh, Sheffield United are good.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
Pookie's a good finisher. And it's like, do your research for goodness
yeah.
sake. But talk to me about because your expectations are probably quite high after the first 2 games. Because yeah, it's a pasting at Liverpool, but you can see that the kind of the sound like David Brent, the kind of vibe of the team is still the same as last season, and you've got your first win, and your striker can clearly score in whatever league. Talk to me about Pookie particularly, and about the expectations after this game.
Yeah, well, I think if you were to pinpoint players that perhaps supporters were a little bit worried that could make the step up, Teemu Pukki would have been right at the bottom of that list, because his game isn't based on some sort of odd pace or um, some sort of odd technique. It's based on his intelligence and his intelligence as a footballer. And I think where the wider world was shocked is because, like you say, a lack of research, admittedly, but equally they saw him play for Celtic, and they saw that player who played for Celtic and didn't quite adapt to the Scottish Premier League. And he was a lot younger then, and he's actually subsequently gone away and played for Bromby and scored a hatful of goals and really improved his game in terms of what he does off the ball. And that's that, when we talk about Teemu Pukki, we have to mention that. And even if you look at some of the goals he scores for Finland, a lot of it, and probably all of his goals, are created by his movement and how he positions himself, either to work a yard of space. And I think one of these goals in the Newcastle game, I think it might be a second, where he just pushes the ball an extra yard just to create that half a yard to generate the power to strike it, is sublime. And yeah, he is, not much has changed from his game from what he was in the Championship, based on movement, based on intelligently reading phases of play, and based on service. And how many goals Teemu Pukki will score this season is dependent on how much service he gets from Norwich. And yeah, in terms of expectation, to move on to that, I think most Norwich fans are probably modest enough to recognise where they are, and recognise who they are as well. And I don't think it was suddenly sky high we're going to get in the Europa League, that sort of nature. But it perhaps people were anticipating that based on the first 2 performances and the quality of the first 2 performances, that they were good enough to survive. And that really has to be the key word, survive, because if they manage to do that, then and we spoke about money at the top end of the show. If they can survive, then the money involved becomes ludicrous. And I mean, it does, even if you get relegated, doesn't it? With a in my opinion, a flawed system in terms of the parachute payments. But if you can survive, you can then build. And so that's probably where Norwich fans felt, probably quite comfortable, perhaps more than possessing high expectations. I think that's probably a fair summary of where people were at.
I think the thing I love about Pookie is that people overcomplicate football so much, and I get the idea that this guy, he's like got 3 things in his head. I'm going to hit it early, I'm going to get a clean hit, and I'm going to put it in the corner. And how many times do you think, oh, he's not hit that goal? Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah,
remember that I was like pitch level in the game against Ipswich. I'm thinking of his second goal where he's quite a way out, and
yeah.
Bart in goal for us is a good goalkeeper, and he
And
didn't hit
big
it.
as well.
Yeah, but he didn't hit it that hard. But just every time, early, lovely, clean hit, right, head down, right in the corner. Just real. I think you say about his intelligence. Obviously, practice and repetition at that. I know he laced one against Southampton recently, but often when he goes through, it's a not.
It's calm, isn't
Yeah,
it? He's calm.
that's the right word. It's really, really calm. Yeah, great player. Be interesting to see what transpires with him. We'll gloss over the back-to-back defeats because you're going to beat
Thanks.
Man City, which is frankly a lot more fun. So some injury problems here. Byram has to come in for Aaron's, which
It's an understatement, that. So,
Byram has to come in for Aaron's, which you would think is this massive drop-off, but Byram's actually been decent. Amadou, who you mentioned, is going to have to play in Zimmerman's spot in defence. Teti is in over Tribal, but Teti will probably still be playing for Norwich in 2045 anyway. So, how on how on earth did Norwich beat Man City with what looked to me like a rather masterfully counter-attacking performance when we were used to Norwich having 17 shots and 55-60% possession?
yeah, this one is looking stranger by the week, I think is fair to say in terms of a result. Just to go back to before that game, I was sat in the press conference when that now infamous press conference where Daniel Farke pretty much reeled off half his squad who were out injured, and I was sitting there thinking, right, okay, he's out, he can come in. No, he's injured, and it sort of worked like that. And it was ludicrous. I've never seen anything like it in football in terms of that injury list. And to be honest, myself included, and I can say this now, they won. Just before kickoff, I turned to my colleagues and said, look, if this is under 5, then Norwich have done well here. But it was, as you say, a really different performance from Norwich. It was a really tactical performance from Norwich, and it was a really adept performance by Norwich. And I think you mentioned the counter-attack there.
We saw that at Leeds, though, didn't we, Connor?
Yeah, we did.
The game
Yeah.
where they sat back and absorbed it and were just
Yeah.
lethal on the. And we know Norwich can attack quickly and move the ball quickly, though, don't we?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to come on to, and you're absolutely spot on in terms of it was very reminiscent of that performance at Ellen Road that night in terms of Manchester City pressing and them moving the ball in limited touches to actually break that press and work their way through the Manchester City defence. And because they pushed their fullbacks so high, I mean, Teemu Pukki and Todd Cantwell were loving life down the sides of the Manchester City defence because of, I think it was Stones and Otamendi, the two. They got so much joy out of them in terms of once they'd actually bypassed that press and that midfield. And that's probably not to continue to keep leaping forward, but that's probably the frustration because suddenly there's this inability to play against teams who press them. And considering what we saw on that Saturday evening against Manchester City, they've proven they can do it with a side that was depleted, was probably low on confidence, but equally their defensive behaviour was really good as well. So they'd obviously done their research, worked out if you force Manchester City to cross the ball into the penalty area, they don't usually score very many goals. With Aguero, I mean, you're not going to score many goals aerially from those positions. So they had a really compact low block in terms of what they did, and then, as you say, broke really well. And again, we're talking not in terms of a long punt forward and running onto it. We're talking about them asserting themselves and playing through the lines, and then looking to get Pukki in beyond and Cantwell in beyond, and utilising that space that they were given by Manchester City. And they did that, and they went 2-0 up, and the stadium was in pure disbelief. And then Aguero scores on the stroke of half time, and everyone sort of looks at each other and goes, well, that was fun while it lasted, to be honest. And then they get the third, and I've never seen an atmosphere, forget Carrow Road, I've never seen an atmosphere like that in any football stadium. It's terrific. I was in the press box, and that stand, you might be aware in terms of the City stand, and that main stand isn't particularly known for being loud, but I think Sam Byram made a challenge in the second half. It would have been Jamal Lewis, actually, because it was on the side. Made a challenge in the second half, and the whole of the stadium were on their feet applauding. And this was about 65 minutes in. It was incredible. So I think the atmosphere around that game probably got them through it. But equally, it was a very, very good performance. Tactically, they got it absolutely spot on.
And I suppose when you reel off all those things that went right that day, I guess there's a little bit of frustration that on the basis, if you could configure some kind of system where you could sit back and counter, and were maybe a little bit more robust behind the ball, that might be better. But as you've said, Farker likes what Farker likes, doesn't he? Connor, it's going to get a bit rubbish now because you're only going to get 1 point in the next 7 games. So 2-0 at Burnley, 2-0 at Palace, 5-1 at home to Villa, 0-0 draw at Bournemouth is the point, 3-1 at home to Manchester United, Brighton 2-0, Watford a 2-0 defeat at home. 1 point in 7. Absolutely brutal run. What went wrong in those games? Why this is the exact opposite than the 8-game 24 points in 8 games we'd had in so that's the royal we. I'd like to reiterate I'm an Ipswich fan here. You had in I get so
Keep
many
telling yourself that.
Yeah, get so many dodgy comments about this stuff. Why so bad in that run?
That's the big question. Why so bad? I think the injury crisis caught up with them, and I'm not using it as an excuse because the performances were bad as well. But they had one fit centre back for that entire run, and that's Ben Godfrey, who's been a centre back for a year, and before that was a defensive midfielder.
And he's 21.
Yeah, exactly.
Never played in the Premier League.
Exactly, and he was shouldering a lot of responsibility. Also, a combination, I think, of teams beginning to take Norwich a bit more seriously, which I didn't think helped them. You beat Manchester City, and suddenly people sort of wake up and go, we might have to try and stop them a bit more, as opposed to they've just come up, we've just play our way and beat them. So they've had to respond to teams almost counteracting what they're good at. Particularly that Burnley game in terms of it was immediately after the Man City game, went straight up to Turf Moor, which is perhaps the worst possible game you could have after a victory of that fashion. And all Burnley did was press them really intensely for 15 minutes. Used the physicality of Chris Wood and Ashley Barnes and won 2-0. And Norwich never really responded to that. And this was the concerning thing for me, is that they were getting beaten, but they were getting beaten comfortably. And it would, I mean, I know you talk about you mentioned the 5-1 against Aston Villa, which was a freak day in itself, I think. But particularly those away games, they were losing 2-0 constantly and deservedly so. And when you do that, that's a worrying trend. And it really sucked a lot of confidence out of Norwich, I think, this run in particular.
So Zimmerman finally comes back. Zimmerman of the absurd win percentage last season. And they beat Everton. So whether that's a coincidence or not, I don't know. I'm sure you'll tell me. Emi Buendia's kind of on the naughty step and bombed out for a game. Kenny McLean is off the front. Cantwell starts as well. And all of a sudden, you don't have this comical Stiepermann guy who you can't figure out what, he's a centre back playing up front or something. You don't have Buendia, who likes to stop on the ball, come inside, dribble, move it. Is this the first little hint of Farke going for, I don't know, more running power, less creativity, or is he just telling Buendia off for a week and going to bring him back anyway?
Well, I think the frustration around Emi Buendia, and I myself was guilty of it when Norwich came up, and was sort of thinking, when he gets on the Premier League, people are going to really catch on to him. And I think Norwich fans were similar because of the way he played in the Championship. It was so good, and he was so good. Particularly technically, for me, he was up there, probably slightly below Pablo Hernandez in terms of quality last season. He was brilliant, and his age as well. But he has got that edge about him. He has got that temper, and he can be a bit stroppy when he loses the ball. And I think that's you get away with that a bit more when you're in a winning team. But suddenly, when you're in a team that's lost 8 on the bounce, or haven't won in 8 certainly, then you stand out a bit more. And gave the ball away for several goals, and was just. Basically was becoming a bit too expensive to keep on the pitch in terms of what he was offering creatively wasn't worth what he was giving away from defensive situations. So it's frustrating because he's such a good player, and even if you delve deep into his numbers, it would indicate that he's been one of the best creative players
his key
in the Premier League.
Passing is off the charts, isn't it?
Yeah, unbelievable. And he is, for a long time, he was second to De Bruyne in terms of assists, but it just hasn't felt like he's been on it really, which is quite strange, as I said, when you look at his numbers. So yeah, it was a bit of a naughty step. moment. But for me, the key difference in that Everton game, and people will talk about Christoph Zimmermann, and in terms of performance, he didn't really stand out. But I think his wider contribution and the
I'm sure
security he
Ben
gave to the
Godfrey was
midfield.
pleased to see him.
Ben Godfrey had a very good game that
Yeah,
day,
there you
so
go. Yeah.
that might sum it up. But the key for me was what you mentioned earlier, and Kenny McLean and pushing him up, because basically what Daniel Farke sacrificed, and he recognised this was a team low on confidence. He said, right, we're not going to play out from the back. We're going to get the basics right. And suddenly you found Tim Krul chipping balls in towards Kenny McLean. And this really was the day where I sort of looked at Kenny and sort of thought, wow, he's quite good in the air. And we saw what he could do, obviously, for the first goal against Manchester City. But I think he won something like 12 aerial duels that day, which was 7 more than anyone on the pitch. And that, for me, really tells you all you need to know about Norwich's approach that day. It was essentially trying to relieve the pressure off their defenders and almost reduce what they were trying to do and stop teams pressing them with such intensity and actually try to play over that and start their possession essentially within either the middle phase of the pitch or within their opponent's half. And McLean was essential to that because he won pretty much everything in the air. And that basically gave Norwich a foundation to actually go and attack a team, which we hadn't seen in a long time. And it allowed Campbell to get on the ball, and it allowed Hernandez to run at players, and Byram actually was forward in a lot of those attacks as well, and they've got so much closer to Teemu Pukki than we'd seen probably since that Manchester City game. He pretty much so isolated in the weeks before, and it again, and you mentioned it earlier on in terms of a template. That for me, that Everton performance was a template for them to take forward, and sadly, it's not quite transpired that way.
So interesting when you've pointed out these sort of 3 or 4 different ways they've had success. It's almost like Farker's basically got until sort of February, March time to try and just slightly, not retool totally, but slightly tweak, because the last season's way, it just looks like it won't work unless the players all step up a little bit together at the same time. It's really interesting to see what he chooses to do and how it plays out, and if he can do it. This is why we talk to people that watch every week. I hadn't seen all these things. Speaking of numbers, financials are in November, at the start of November. The headline figure is a 34.2 million operating loss, but we talked about banking the money, and the last sentence on the Norwich City website says, following promotion to the Premier League, the club anticipates a substantial operating profit in the financial year to June 2020. My God, there's still transactions. Josh Murphy, Alex Pritchard, James Maddison, money coming in there. The back end of some other transfers. It feels like the slate gets properly wiped clean, and you're in a good financial position. It's not the first of the year in football land, but July the 1st next year when the transfer window opens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to that being in a strange situation where next summer they're going to be in a stronger position to recruit than they were this summer. That's not to say there wasn't money there. I think there was money there, and it's not a case of them not wanting to spend it. But in Stuart Webber, you've not got a guy who's going to go and chuck a load of money at a player they don't want.
I meant to mention it at the time. The difference between Norwich, Villa, and Sheffield United is Villa, to even maintain their playoff team. Mings was borrowed, Abraham was borrowed, and Tuanzebe was borrowed, and they were all first team players. So to even maintain that level, they had to, spend a load of money. And Sheffield United had a borrowed number 10. Okay, they've retooled, and Billy Sharp is an amazing player, but he's 34 or something. So I think Norwich didn't have as many kind of immediate holes to fill to even just match their team of last year, right?
I'd agree, and I'd suggest that if Norwich had Aston Villa's side last year and came up, and they simply wouldn't be able to do it. It essentially would have been a load of under-16s because they wouldn't have been able to recruit like that. And when I said that they'll have a bit to spend, they would have had probably a third of what Sheffield United spent on Ollie McBurney. So just to give perspective, it wouldn't have been any eye-watering amount. Again, Norwich probably had a choice. They probably didn't want to spend that. They had a choice to spend it, and obviously they decided not to. They were after a French winger who subsequently has gone to Nice, and they were prepared to pay within 10 million quid for him, but ultimately it didn't happen for whatever reason. So there was money there to spend, and it was a case of the right deals not necessarily happening at the right time. But yeah, you're quite right. They're in a completely different situation to Sheffield United and Aston Villa, who did need to strengthen their side. Sheffield United did need strikers. Aston Villa did need essentially a whole new first team.
Two centre backs basically as well.
Exactly. But the difference is they weren't in a position to spend 30 million on Tyrone Mings, which looks like a fantastic buy for just on record. But that Norwich weren't and won't probably for a few seasons be in a position to do that unless they sustain themselves in the Premier League. So the financials involved are completely different to any other side in the Premier League, and I'd also probably chuck in some in the Championship as well.
Next 3 games brings us up to the current day. Only one more point comes against Arsenal, but Teemu Pukki manages to, what a player, 8 goals in 16 games from 19th in the league. Outstanding. So as we stand today, we are recording, what day is it, Connor? It's Wednesday
the 11th.
11th. So this will be up by the weekend, but just to date this, 19th in the table. Where am I looking? 4 points from safety, 34 goals against, which is second only to Southampton, who did manages to equal Ipswich's 9-0 record Premier League defeat.
Well done for getting that in there. Well done.
I just want it off our back now. It's not ours anymore. That belongs to Southampton now. You can have that one. 11 defeats is 2 more than any other team. Talk to me about this current league position, the bottom of the table as it stands. Is this going to get better or worse?
It's difficult as we sit here now to envisage a situation where they can survive. To be frank about it, I think they need something like 1.22 points per game, which in the Premier League is incredibly difficult. They've had games where if they have aspirations of surviving...
Connor, is that from now or is that across the whole season?
From now, yeah, from now. Okay. So from the position they're in now. As you said, they're shipping too many goals. They're conceding. It's not necessarily they're conceding the chances. It's the quality of the chances they're conceding, which is a problem. That Arsenal game was a perfect example of that in terms of Norwich working really hard to get themselves in front twice, playing really well, and then conceding from set pieces essentially. And it just feels like it's a little bit too easy to beat them at the moment. And I don't want to use this word in vain, but they're just a bit soft, and that's not criticism. It's just the way they are in terms of how they play and how they defend. They don't defend well enough. They essentially look like in the side, which is not a pleasant place to be when you're relying on a 34-year-old defensive midfielder who's out of contract next summer. So yeah, it does feel a bit bleak. I think the loss to Sheffield United blew a lot of wind out of people's sails. Not necessarily the defeat itself, because Sheffield United have been outstanding this season, and they almost epitomise what you have to do when you come up to the Championship in terms of making yourselves hard to beat. They remind me a lot of Norwich when they came up under Paul Lambert in terms of not being particular. They are pretty to watch, Sheffield United. They're a lot prettier to watch than Norwich were under Paul Lambert in the Premier League. But in terms of what they do off the ball, they're competitive. They're in your face. You always know. You know when you're playing against them. And for Norwich, they felt a little bit too easy to play against. And it concerns me that there are periods in games where teams up their levels for 10, 15 minutes, and that decides the game. And yeah, that for me is where the issues lie. So it's not impossible. A couple of wins changes their situation completely. So it's doable. But I'd say at the moment the mood is pretty, maybe bleak's a bit strong, but it's certainly a lot of people who feel disheartened by what they've seen this season, I think, after how they expected it to go in the summer.
And in January, when we get to January, there's 20 games in, but there's a game on January the 1st, so call that 21 games, so 17 to go. You've already said about the books. Anyone coming in January, possibly even for next season to get on this year's books?
Yeah, I think they'll do business in January. I think they have to, particularly defensively. I, I would imagine they'll probably do a couple of deals. I don't think it'll be anything major, but and this sort of lends itself well because if they're cut adrift by a bigger margin than they are currently in January, then realistically, the only players they're going to be able to attract are in a similar vein to those who have come in before in terms of being in lower divisions, hoping to prove themselves with an eye to the Championship. That's not being negative. That's realistic. That's where Norwich City are. So it will be interesting to see what type of signings they do bring in and whether they do anything with the loan market. Of course, they've still got one option for a domestic loan. But if Patrick Roberts gets recalled, as I would probably expect him to, as I sit here right now, then that almost frees up a couple of spaces as well. So whether they look to do something again, they have the option. This is me sort of thinking out loud a little bit, but in the same way that we talk about them Naismith deals, and that's January of 2016, where they pretty much gambled all of their chips to survive. If they bring in a experienced 30-year-old, similar with Ralph Fearman, but they do it for 6 months and don't give him a 3-year contract, then that's a lot more sustainable than if obviously signing him long term. So it wouldn't surprise me if they go down that sort of route. But yeah, I think anything they do, certainly permanently, will be with a view to the Championship next season if that's where they find themselves.
Interesting. Is there any worry that there's a point where if Norwich want to become a sustained Premier League team, and okay, this might be, 2-3 years down the line and another relegation, another promotion, they can't pull rabbits out of hats for free transfers from Brondby or, young Argentinians. There will be a point where they have to go to the well with 8 million, 10 million
Yeah.
long contracts. It's going to be interesting to see when they feel ready to go there again, isn't it? And that's going to be a good
Yeah,
test of Stuart Webber as well, isn't it?
absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting you say about their aspirations. They also had the AGM recently, where they basically said, look, our target is to become a top 26 club in England, which
They already
is
are.
exactly, but that's the aim is to solidify that over the next 5 years, and they rolled out this magnificent 5-year plan that was all very David McNally-esque, but that's where they find themselves, and I think at the moment it's all about getting the processes off the pitch right, because they're still way ahead of where they expected to be and where Stuart Webber expected them to be when he came up. They're still ahead of the curve. I wouldn't say this group of players is probably the finished article in terms of where they want Norwich City to be, and as you said, there are going to be bumps in the road, and there might be another relegation. But for me, the interesting part and the testing part, and of course their philosophy and their processes and their philosophy is going to get tested a lot this season on the pitch. But if they go down again, is how much is that going to be tested off the pitch? Because when you go up, it's brilliant to roll out a new academy building at your training ground. But when you go down and you're trying to get promotion, I think the fans are slightly less forgiving in that situation. So it'll be interesting to see how the fans respond to that, and equally how they respond to that. So yeah, there's interesting times coming up, but I think they just need to be realistic and acknowledge where they are. They're never going to compete in terms of finances with anyone else in the Premier League, certainly currently. And so they have to prepare for all outcomes. And I don't think supporters can be too upset at them that it hasn't quite gone the way that many anticipated. But I think really the success is that they're even in the Premier League in the first place. And again, there'll be some people who view that as negative, but in terms of finances and in terms of the squad they've assembled,
now, is it? Yeah,
that's the reality. Yeah. So I think, look, brighter days probably lie ahead for Norwich. I think it's riding this moment out and hope and learning from this experience, because I've no doubt if they do go down, Daniel Farke will be a better coach and they'll have a set of better players for it.
If they do go down, just 3 names, and it's basically the right-hand side of the team: Aarons, Buendia, and Pukki. Yes, okay, the figures will probably be very, very high, even with Pukki's age. If he's going to have a 15-goal Premier League season probably to his name. I know the figures will be big. How hard will it be to likely replace players that good, particularly at Championship level, where you could call Aaron's basically a a playmaker in the Championship, isn't he? He's halfway up the pitch the whole time, starting most of the attacks. Buendia, no one could get near him, and Pukki scored nearly 30 goals. That How hard will that be to replace, even with a parachute payment and a good those that type of caliber of player for the Championship is hard to get into the Championship, isn't it?
It is, yeah, but then in the same vein, everyone was saying it would be hard to replace James Maddison and it would be hard to replace Josh Murphy. And I think they took basically 40 goals out of their side, didn't they? And managed to replace them with Pukki and Buendia. So I think there's got to be a level of trust that they can do it again and that they do have the recruitment processes. But equally, every sign is a gamble. So when for every Teemu Pukki, you get a Joseph Dermich that hasn't quite worked, and that's what you have to be prepared for. And they're, as much as we praise Stuart Webber and we praise Norwich City's recruitment team, there are a lot of signings that haven't worked. And Ben Marshall is one you can throw into that, I think, because he was one they signed as a right back when actually they could have concentrated on just putting Max Aarons through, and that was one they didn't quite get right, and he left.
Ben Marshall and James Husband, that was the original plan. My God,
exactly, yeah, and so they've had to change and adapt, and every recruitment process hasn't worked. But look, I think they're modest enough to say whatever happens, and the fees for those guys will be ridiculous if Ben Godfrey in particular, I think is going to be the one who commands the biggest fee. Pukki with his age, I think out of the names you've mentioned, he's probably the most likely to stay, just because I'm not sure many teams, perhaps Manchester United, will go for a £40 million bid given their transfer business. But certainly
goal scorer though. Premier League goal scorer.
Very true. I think it's more likely for him to be shipped off to Turkey or somewhere like that, where there would be a lot. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Than perhaps a Premier League move. But yeah, it would be very difficult for Norwich to, having done all this work, get promoted, to then come back down and have to rebuild again. Because I think that for everyone involved and for Daniel Farke, that would be incredibly frustrating given the journey they've been on since he arrived.
If you can you give? I got Ben to do this for Blades Pod. Can you give me a grade for how have Norwich dealt with the big jump? And you can give it as many caveats as you like, because it's not as simple as 19th, it's gone badly. What grade do you give Webber and Farke for how they've dealt with the jump up?
I'll split this in terms of off the pitch and on the pitch. So they're the only caveats I've had. So off the pitch, they've built a new training ground. They've repaid everyone who invested in the Canaries bond, which was the scheme they basically had that allowed supporters to essentially pay for the training ground, and the club would then pay them back. They've managed to pay that off sooner than they anticipated. Going up to Colney now is completely different. It's not a place where it's full of porta cabins. It looks professional. It's a lovely building on the side. So in terms of legacy and in terms of off the pitch stuff, and even as minute as them buying patches of land around Carrow Road now, so they now own all that land. So in the future, if they do get themselves into a situation where they can look to expand the stadium, they're now in a position to do that.
Go up to sort of 32 to 35,000, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So they're now in a position where in the future, if the finances dictate, they can do that. So even little things like that and off the pitch and everything in their academy is going well as well in terms of players and loans. So I'd probably give that like a B, maybe an A in terms of stuff off the pitch, because they're going to be, even if they go down, they're going to be in a lot healthier position than when they came up, certainly off the pitch. And then on the pitch, it's difficult. I must admit, I expected them to be a bit better than this. And I think what's frustrating is I keep coming back to the same question recently. Is it confidence, or is it a lack of confidence, or is it a lack of quality? And too often I feel the quality is outweighing it slightly, which is a shame. But the thing is, I think when you win games every week in the Championship, you know how to win a football match. You said there earlier on, everything's not pretty, and it's not. Norwich have 60% possession and they're playing this wonderful football every week. Sometimes you do have to grind out a 1-0 win, or you do have to go to Wigan and make sure you don't lose the game. And it's almost like a memory bank. You know how to do it, and it just feels like they've lost that slightly. And suddenly, when midfielders were coming to look to take the ball off centre back, suddenly they're not doing that anymore, and they're not able to move up the pitch as a collective. It's suddenly actually a lot more long balls, and that's disappointing. But I think you have to remember that this. I mean, someone like Christoph Simon, for example, was playing in the fourth tier of German football 4 years ago. He's now playing in the Premier League. So the jump up is massive, and I think it's just unfortunate that a few of them, as we sit here right now, we don't know what's happened. They could go on a miraculous run where they survive comfortably, and it's not unheard of. I think Southampton were in a similar position, probably 2 points worse off than Norwich were last season. So it is doable, but I think that's the frustration for a lot of people, is they haven't stepped up in the way many anticipated. So probably hovering reluctantly around the DC area. If I was to grade that, I don't know what that would work out with the new school system, but the less said about that, the better. All numbers now, isn't it? So, but that's probably where I think they're at. So a lot of positive stuff, a lot of not so positive stuff, but again, you have to caveat all of that with where they are and how unique they are as a football club.
A long game, I think, given, and as you say, James Maddison 1 inch further to his left. And this is what I said to my mate Russ, the Norwich fan, the other day. Look at where Middlesbrough are right now.
Yep.
That's Norwich if they didn't sell Maddison and fund that season, and
absolutely
no parachutes and have to, it's so it is what it is, isn't it? Can you just talk a little bit without too much envy, especially with the Blades, about your classmates here, Sheffield United and Villa? Just quickly, how do you think they've done?
Oh, Sheffield United have been fantastic. I've really enjoyed watching them. I think they've been a great advert for teams who look to step up. As I said earlier, I think they've got not everything right, because you never get everything right, but in terms
all three of the teams, Connor, sorry to interrupt, all three of the teams, none of them have gone right. And I like Steve Bruce, but you know how Steve Bruce will play with Newcastle all season. None of them have done that, have they?
No, and that's the brilliance of this Sheffield United team. They've done what I hope Norwich would do, in terms of, this is how we play. It doesn't matter that we're in the Premier League. We're going to play that way, and we're going to win games doing it. And that's what they've done. And it's no shock to me, having watched them last season, that they're doing as well as they did. I think Chris Wilder is a fantastic manager, very tactically astute. I think they often get pigeonholed, don't they, as this almost kick and run team who are very direct, and it's just nonsense. It's complete nonsense, because they're a side.
Do you think there's anything in the fact that Sheffield United were deceptively good defensively last year? I know everyone talked about Jack O'Connell being in the penalty box and getting goals and assists and stuff, but do you think there's anything in the fact that Norwich were a brilliant attacking team who literally every time they reset just did another attack and it was unrelenting? Do you think that transferable skill is actually more used to you in the Premier League, the defensive side, when you're not going to have the ball, than Norwich, where I've got my mate texting me saying, "Oh, who are the two Norwich wingers? They look really good." I'm like, "Mate, they're the fullbacks." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, quite possibly. I don't think they've got the structure that Sheffield United do, and what Sheffield United are really good at, and it sort of contradicts what I've just said, and they play brilliant football, but defensively they're so structured, they're so organised, they have a plan, and that's why they can win games of football in the Premier League. Because look, to win any game in the Premier League is difficult. It's draining mentally and physically. It's difficult, far more difficult than in the Championship, although the Championship is a bit more relentless in how often you have to do it. But so what Sheffield United have done really well is build a base and keep themselves in games. And then when you do that, it's easier to then have the confidence to then play your way and then score the goal that wins you the game or draws you the game or whatever.
What about
and I
Villa,
think they've, in terms of Villa, I think again, all three are so different. I don't think Villa have done badly. I think perhaps certainly the external press were expecting a lot more of them. And again, it comes down to money breeds expectation, doesn't it? That's the nature of it. I think in Jack Grealish, they've got an unbelievable footballer. I think considering how they've spent and considering the lazy comparisons to Fulham, they've done very well, and that squad has had to gel. I'm impressed with Wesley up front. I think he's a very good footballer. John McGinn is, for me, unbelievable. I think he's going to go for a lot of money if they do decide to sell him. But I think both of those two sides will stay up. That's my opinion.
And what do you miss about the Championship? Don't say beating Ipswich.
Wouldn't dream of it. What do I miss about the Championship? No VAR. I missed that. Um,
I got my first experience at your game on
how did you find
Sunday.
it? How did you
Um,
find it?
well, look,
Frustrating?
because no, because it was such a novelty to me. I was just all giddy with excitement. I have never seen a player be sent off and then sent back on again. But yeah, let's not go down there. I will bow to any Premier League fans' knowledge of VAR because I've literally experienced one game of it. But yeah, certainly
Yeah.
an interesting twist that can only get better. Really, I think.
Oh, it can't get much worse.
There you go.
Yes. You might as well take the A out of VAR because it is just a video referee really. But anyway, we digress. I miss the volume of games. I really enjoy playing Saturday, Tuesday, and having, because if you lose a game in the Championship, you've not got time to dwell on it. It's as I said, it's relentless. You've got another one to prepare, and um, I miss that aspect of it, and I think it's a more enjoyable league in terms of competition. There aren't this massive golfing competition when Liverpool turn up, and you're just thinking, goodness me, I hope we keep it below six. It's there's a genuine belief you can win every game, and of course there is that in the Premier League as well, but to a lesser extent. So I miss that element as well. But however long this Premier League adventure lasts, I think you've got to enjoy it, because for Norwich City, and they're a bad example because they've sort of yo-yoed. I don't like that phrase, but they've bounced between the two leagues. But I think when you're in the Premier League, you have to enjoy it for what it is, and particularly when you're a side like Norwich who are trying to do things so differently. I think there's a lot to admire about the way Norwich are doing it, even if they don't succeed this year, to be honest.
Brilliant, Connor. Great to hear from you again, and so pleased about the going pro and all of that jazz.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
where can people read your obviously your work just improved twofold the second you went pro, didn't
Oh
it?
well,
It
well.
just got amazing, didn't
I'm
it?
I'm I'm glad you said it. No, you can find all my stuff. Pinkin.com is the place to find it, as
And on
well as,
Twitter?
and on Twitter, CJ Southwell 1902. So all very bog standard. And if you like newspapers, then of course the EDP is I think it's the best selling in the country. I should know that,
Is
daily
it actually?
regional newspaper. Yeah. So there you go. There's a nice stat for you.
Outstanding.
I'll have won some raffles at work for that. So that's nice.
Connor, thank you so much for coming on. Can we try and check in before the end of the season, and we'll hopefully there's stuff to talk about. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope we're not talking about a relegation that's a bit gutless, but we'll
Well,
see.
put it this way, Ipswich essentially went down on like January the 2nd last year when they lost at home to Millwall. So it can be
Very true.
it can be done and dusted quite early. So this was the big jump, we're calling this, looking at all of the three promoted teams. I know I got a bit of jibber jabbering on the YouTube comments. When are you going to the Premier League game for? Well, we built up lots of subscribers from Sheffield United and Norwich and Villa last year, lots of friends and people like Connor who we want to get back on the channel. So this is why we are revisiting, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you don't, there'll be some championship stuff soon. God, we're halfway through another 3-game week at the moment. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on, Connor. Usual plugs from me here. Twitter at Benjamin Bloom. Subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. Support on patreon.com. Connor, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me.